Hello, AP Environmental Science students. Welcome back to another exciting, hopefully, lecture about ecosystems. So today, what we're going to be doing is learning about how energy flows through an ecosystem. And before we get started, I want you to think about this question. As a kid, I was always wondering. About things like what would happen if a tiger and a bear got in a fight, or what would happen if a polar bear and a shark encountered each other. And I was wondered, why are there so many different plants out there I can see, and insects, but I don't see a lot of top predators. I don't see these organisms in our environment. I want you to think about that as we move forward. So today we're going to talk about ecosystems, and we're talking about four different topics. Number one, primary productivity. So we're going to be talking about what is photosynthesis, going back to bio one as a ninth grader, talking about respiration, and talking about what is called net primary production. We're then going to segue and talk about trophic pyramids. So how does energy move through those different levels of consumption? It's going to go right into talking about energy flow in terms of the 10% rule, which is really important in understanding our ecosystems. And last, we're going to hopefully connect something you're very familiar with: food chains and food webs. So before we get started, learning targets, always important. So what are we trying to do today? Hopefully by the end of this week, you should be able to explain how solar energy, is acquired and transferred by living organisms. Explain how energy flows, so it's a one-way ticket from the sun, and how matter, we talked about earlier, cycles through trophic levels. Lastly, determine how energy decreases as it flows through the ecosystem. So that's that 10% rule. All right, to begin with, we're going to have to talk a little physics. And these might be things you're familiar with, maybe not, but thermodynamics. So laws of thermodynamics that pertain to ecosystems. Number one, first law of thermodynamics, that energy cannot be created or destroyed, only transferred from one form to another. So plants are not creating energy, they're only absorbing it and utilizing it and transforming it to another form. Second law of thermodynamics, in the path of energy, as it's transformed from one form to another, there's loss in the form of heat and the entropy of that energy, meaning the quality of that energy decreases. So heat, we're going to learn, is a low quality energy. It's low in terms of the electromagnetic spectrum, and it tends to be a sign. If you feel your computer right now, you're feeling heat, that's inefficiency in that system. And a lot of times we're trying to cool things down because they are not working really efficiently and they're producing a lot of heat. Then ecosystems, heat takes its form by body heat, our own metabolism, but also it's just loss of heat of calories that no longer can do work in a meaningful way. Okay, so very important, very fortunate for us here on this planet is we have a perpetual source of energy, and that is our sun, which creates our currency. Living things use this energy to do work and to accumulate mass. So in order to take that matter, those cycles of matter, and then put it into our bodies, we need an energy source to do that. The sun obviously is continually giving us energy. There are places on this earth that are independent of solar radiation, down in hydrothermic vents in mainly the Atlantic and the Pacific. They've been found produce high energy molecules released at high temperatures from the earth, and microbes are able to do this process called chemosynthesis, which means taking that energy, that chemical energy, and converting it into ATP, much like energy is produced in photosynthesis. Okay, and respiration. The sun is the ultimate source. Life can be organized, and we're going to look at different trophic levels by how energy flows through an ecosystem. And think about your iNatural spot. You've been looking at plants mainly, but now you're starting to look, and you have been looking at animals, and thinking about their relationship and how they're usually tied in some way to getting energy. Okay, so primary production, what is it? It's the rate in which solar energy is converted into organic compounds. And remember back to biology, organic usually refers to carbon-based compounds. So, and those are long chains, and carbon is a molecule that can form these long chains because it shares electrons, and can form complex compounds, such as DNA, such as polymers that make up starches and make up fibers, cellulose. So the amount of plant material grown in a given area, and it's usually measured in units of energy over time. Typically, it's kilocalories of energy per meter squared over a period of a year. So think about these peas here. Remember, we talked about legumes and their role in the nitrogen cycle, being able to fix nitrogen. Well, this shows their growth. And what are they doing? They're taking that sunlight, they're absorbing that carbon dioxide, they're producing organic compounds, starches, sugars, cellulose, and we could measure that. And we'd probably, to do that, we'd have to do a caloric analysis, or we can also measure their dry mass. Usually it's a dry mass. You'd have to take these after they're done growing and dig them up and dry them in an oven, actually, measure them. So back to Bio 1, remember the formulas for cellular respiration, photosynthesis mirror each other, and they're both very important in understanding what is called net primary production. So you remember learning about the difference between plant and animal cells, and hopefully you remember that both of them have mitochondria. And probably the only thing you remember from Bio 1 as a ninth grader is that mitochondria are the powerhouse of the cell, right? They create all the energy for the cell. So we know that plants have mitochondria. Therefore, they do photosynthesis, as we know, but they also do cellular respiration. So some of the oxygen and some of the glucose produced in photosynthesis is utilized by the plant in order to create ATP and to do work inside the plant, to create new cells, to create chemicals they can release, those kind of things. They need that ATP energy. So very important in what we're going to be talking about next, gross versus net primary production. So primary production, there's two types. One is, as I mentioned, gross primary production. And this is used in economics too. They talk about, in GDP we talked about, and calculations of businesses and their profit margins. They talk about their gross income, what they make, and then they have to subtract the amount of money needed to produce their product. It's the same principle here. So gross primary productivity is the total rate of photosynthesis in a given area. Somewhat difficult to measure, but we know, we can infer that this is happening, that we've got gross primary production. What we measure as ecologists is the net primary productivity. So that is the amount of energy stored in primary producers after subtracting the energy loss through respiration. So the biomass accumulated, created by the plant. Oh, that's a cool little wasp, a little parasitic wasp. Biomass produced by the plant, we know that it used some of that energy just to do work, right? And do cellular respiration to produce ATP. But what's left over is the biomass of that plant, and we can measure that and calculate what is our net primary production. So usually what we see and measure is net primary production. We can infer that respiration is happening. All right. So think about that tree. right now in your backyard. It's done all this net primary production, and then it takes those high sugar molecules and starts to store them in the roots to make it through the winter, and then use those reserves to get going again next year. All right, so when we look at biomes, and we talked about biomes last week, you can see ones that are very productive in terms of their net primary production include things like estuaries, swamps, and tropical rainforests. I'm going to make a distinction and show you some examples in my yard, but I don't have estuaries or swamps, so I do have a little pond, and I'll be talking about that. And they're very productive, partly because they're aquatic ecosystems. They usually have plenty of nutrients, and they can accumulate biomass and store that biomass in the ground. Tropical rainforests, most of their biomass and their energy is up in the canopy. They don't really store much into the ground. That's why soils tend to be pretty poor in tropical regions. So once that biomass is removed, the forest is cut down, it loses its production pretty quickly, and they're very sensitive to loss of production. You can see as you progress down and get less and less primary production, you typically run into biomes that are drier or they are colder, because those are big factors we learned about biomes that cause a lot of primary production. Okay, so just know the big ones that are very productive and ones that aren't so productive. When we talk about trophic levels, and this is just showing some examples, you guys know that down at the bottom there are producers, and those are the plants. And if we were to look at all the plants in a given area and measure all that energy, we know that only 10% of that energy will make it up to the primary consumers, which include things like insects and, in this case, mice, birds, and up into the next secondary consumers. We've got some examples here of things that would be secondary consumers: red panda, grizzly bear, bald eagle, and those organisms only gain about 1%. I'm sorry, 10% of that energy again, and eventually, what's left for the tertiary consumers is 0.1%. This, I don't really like the examples in here. Just know that know what the difference is between these different levels. We'll be talking mainly about the roles of tertiary consumers when we talk about keystone species, and producers. Obviously, we're talking about primary production. The big takeaway, though, is there's a decrease in numbers, usually of individuals. If you were to measure all the individual producers, all the individual primary consumers, you'd see the producers. There are a lot more individuals, a lot more biomass, and consequently a lot more energy, a lot more kilocalories in those different levels. And 10% is reduced every time you go up. Okay, and again, what does that have to do with? The second law of thermodynamics that states anytime energy is transferred from one form to another, there's going to be a loss of quality. Okay, so I just want to foreshadow, we are going to be talking, when we get into biodiversity, talking about keystone species, but I think it's worth mentioning here that certain species are called keystone. That means they're fundamental to the functioning of that ecosystem, and oftentimes they're tertiary consumers. They're on the top, they're apex predators. The classic example we're going to be talking about is the wolves that were reintroduced to Yellowstone and what impact those had on the whole ecosystem. So affecting animals like deer and elk, and consequently changing the vegetation. The vegetation was able to grow in certain areas where it couldn't before. And in fact, we're going to learn changing even the hydrology of the Yellowstone National Park. Okay, excuse me. Food chains and food webs. These should be very familiar because you remember these maybe from even elementary school. So the relationship of how energy is transferred from one level to another, that's a food chain. Always remember that the arrows are pointing to the direction of energy. So where's the energy going? It's going to the next level. Food webs is more complex, usually visual map of feeding relationships and energy flow, and it can include many organisms and many different connections. So here's a very simplified example of a food chain. Here are primary productions out in the open ocean, mainly algae species, which feed small crustaceans, and all the way up to our quaternary consumer up here, the great white shark. In contrast, here's a food web, and you can see all these interconnections between organisms. This one is interesting. It shows ticks, and there's a lot of research actually about ticks and Lyme disease, and the role that actually top predators, back to that apex, like wolves, can have on reducing populations of ticks and Lyme disease. If anybody looks that up and tells me how wolves can reduce Lyme disease, I'll give you extra credit. You have to email me. First one to email me how they can do that will get extra credit on this assignment. But you can see the connections here between organisms, and showing again energy flow. Energy is flowing from the chipmunk into the snake, from the insects into the snake, and how they're all connected. All right. So food webs, food chains, that's it. So to recap, terrestrial and near surface aquatic biomes get their energy from the sun. So remember, we talked about aquatic biomes such as coral reefs being very productive, areas near the surface, and they're maximizing that sunlight on the surface, and they can produce a lot of biomass. Productivity is the measurement of the amount of solar radiation converted into plant tissues. Communities and ecosystems can be divided into trophic levels based on the available biomass, energy, and biomass. So you looked at your iNaturalist study site, and you mainly looked at producers, right? Plants, and then you started to look mainly at insects as your second group, and those were primary consumers. Only 10% of the energy moves up each trophic level, and that's because of the second law of thermodynamics. Food chains and webs show energy flow at different scales. So I think that's the last bullet, and I hope you enjoyed the presentation, and I hope you can bear my lectures. Until next time, peace. So what can photosynthesis do? Well, it produces biomass. Behind me is one of my favorite plants. This is called cup plant, and it's always impressed me as something that can produce a lot of biomass, has a high net primary production. I'm 6'4". You can see these plants are probably well over 8 feet. So a cup plant is a native perennial sunflower. It's able to take that carbon out of the atmosphere, right, and through solar radiation do photosynthesis and take those glucose molecules and make starches, and most of this, what you see material, is cellulose. So if I were to calculate the net primary production of this area, I would need to chop down all this material, dry it so it's like this, and that's what's happening in the fall as it goes into dormancy. And also obviously need the roots, and weigh that mass, and you get a sense of mass, and that would be over this area, and then calculate it in one growing season. So as mentioned in the lecture, many of the biomes that produce massive amounts of biomass that are very productive, have the highest net primary production, are aquatic, so estuaries and wetlands. And part of the reason is aquatic ecosystems, I'm going to pull out some plants here, have lots of nutrients in the wet soil. And those wet soils provide an opportunity for massive amount of roots and biomass of material, and as that material accumulates, it forms peat, and peat is this organic matter, and it's really important in storing carbon, because remember, photosynthesis, taking that CO2 out of the atmosphere, putting it into the biomass, and if it accumulates and packs down, it becomes a sink for carbon. So those very productive ecosystems, big part of their natural capital is storing carbon. unlike, I would say, rainforests. I think rainforests do that okay, but I think wetlands are better, according to most of the data, in terms of retaining and storing that material into the ground. So energy transfer within ecosystems can happen through indirect means, meaning this bee is not eating this plant and gaining all the energy, but rather just some of the byproducts of nectar produced by photosynthesis, and then it can use that energy again to do work and to produce biomass. They also will extract pollen, which is more of a protein-based food source, especially important for developing young. These are common bumblebees. And this is an aster, I think, I'm not sure which one, silky, I believe. And pretty soon these guys are going to be having queens, producing queens. Queens go off into the ground, part of their life cycle, make it through the winter, and then start a new colony. They get fertilized in the spring and start a new colony next spring. This is actually a fly, a hoverfly. It's a bee mimic, and it obviously is extracting nectar from that flower and gaining energy.